Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Laura Page Khyber, and I'm a curator of performance here at the MCA, and I am thrilled to welcome you all here this afternoon and introduce today's speakers. To set the stage, very briefly, I'll share just a bit about why I'm excited to have each of these people here on stage with us today. And if you'd like to read more about them individually, all of their bios are online on our website. But Kaneza Schaal is an artist and theater maker whose work I've had the pleasure of following for several years. And her creative process poses big ideas and is deeply researched and explores collaborations across many disciplines. And her performances take place on stages large and small, in DIY basements, to public courtyards, to giant opera houses, and she seeks expansive audiences. And next week, we have the privilege to present her work, KL2, downstairs here at the MCA in our theater space, as a part of a series centered on the idea of lineages. It's the final performance in this year's series, and previous artists have approached the idea in a number of ways. Some have challenged notions of genre and classification in the arts. Others have experimented with methods of restaging and documentation in performance. And others have mined their own personal artistic archive to create new work. And now, with Kaneza's show, we'll examine who and what gets immortalized in history and ingrained in our culture through the stories that we tell. And I can't wait to hear more about it in just a moment. Natacha is a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago, and I cannot think of anyone better suited to explore the ideas in this work. Her research is at a perfect intersection of these ideas. She studies post-colonial critique, musical movements, and the political and cultural conditions of African people, both on the continent and in the diaspora. And finally, our moderator, Jane, who is an incredible champion of art and social justice through her organization, Project And. She's based here in Chicago, and she's a curator, writer, and producer focused on creating new models of cultural participation and experiences with social impact. So with that, thank you all so much for being here. After the talk, there will be a bit of time for questions from you all. Captioning is available. You see it here at the top of the screen. If you're having trouble seeing it because of these beautiful plants on the ceiling, you can also scan. There's a QR code on the door, and you can see the captions on your phone. Thank you to our generous sponsors. Oh, here's that QR code again for the captions. Thank you for being here today, and enjoy.
Thank you. Well, we are going to start with Natacha on really. Sorry.
It's on. It's ready for you.
All right. It's ready for my bum. We're going to start really utilizing your incredible scholarship and asking you to just kind of place the kind of historical context and really bring us up to the present tense of why the Congo and the DRC are important and why this is even something that is being investigated by a lot of people, but Kaneza in particular.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. So a central figure that Kaneza's performance is trying to deconstruct and exercise is King Leopold was a king in Belgium from 1835 to 1909. So I thought I would start by asking you in the audience if you've heard of King Leopold. Yes? Fantastic. Okay, King Leopold aside, the Congo, as we know it today, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is probably, I will have to double check, but one of the biggest country in Africa right now. It's enormously rich with lots of different things, 120 million people to begin with. It's what my friend has called a geological scandal because it has so many resources. So I'll start by just listing a few. Wood, fertile land, cobalt, copper, oil, uranium, gold, lithium. It has 3 4 major lakes that are, if you understand a little bit the economy, are extremely important for commerce. So Lake Tanganyika, Lake Kivu, Lake Kyoga, and Lake Albert, which is a name that is reminiscent of colonization because it's referring to Albert, who was Belgian. Okay. The region itself has methane and coltan, which you've probably heard is extremely important for electronic batteries. Okay, so that is what brought King Leopold to the Congo in 1876. And he was helped by an association called the International Association for the Exploration and Civilization of Central Africa. I won't get into the details of what that association did, but as you can tell from the name, it was a colonizing venture which ideologically assumed that it was bringing civilization to the peoples of Africa, as was the case elsewhere on the continent, in the Americas, and in many other places in the world. So in 1876, this association with King Leopold began basically operating in the Congo as a corporate state, extracting the resources. And they exploited the resources, but also were extremely violent. Congo also has rubber, I should say, because that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially with the performance. So they exploited and mismanaged the place so much that the Belgian colony had to step in 1908 and actually annex it as part of the country's governance. So it became an official colony in 1908 until independence in 1960, which was fought really hard, with a central figure being Patrice Lumumba, who was a freedom fighter who became the first prime minister of independent Congo and was assassinated not even a month into his tenure with the help of the CIA. So that's kind of like the background. So fast forward, because of this vast sort of place and its richness, the country has never really been allowed to exercise its rights for self-governance and self-determination and freedom. And lots of people are involved in trying to exploit the place. So I want to fast forward to the latest sort of iteration of political violence that happened in the Congo in the 1990s. And I'm going to list who was involved to give you a sense of how important this place is and how basically exploited from all sides it is. So there was a gigantic war, which I can get into, that began really in 1998 and ended in 2002, the first part. And just in that war, Uganda, its neighbors, Rwanda, Burundi, and people in the Congo, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Chad were all involved. It has been referred to as Africa's World War. So at least 7 post-colonial states were involved. Between 2022 and 2025, another iteration of political violence erupted, and in there, again, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, Sudan, South Africa, Zambia, Central African Republic, and Congo itself. Hopefully that gives you a sense of the importance of this place and the reason we should keep talking about what happened, but also gives you a sense of the links between the past, the moment of Leopold that Kaneza's performance is about, and our own time, contemporary times today. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Natacha.
Thank you so much. Can I just ask for a little audience participation? Does anybody have a pen? I am a up-to-the-minute learner, so I really like to take notes all the time. Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to bring up, one of the things that Project Dan got really involved in the stories of the DRC and the Congo, one through one of the Project Dan fellows, Lynn Nottage, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright who did Ruined, and she was a fellow at Project Dan to write that story. And then we also partnered with Lindsay Dario on an exhibition called Women of War. And, before we could even get into conversation about gender and colonization and the idea of half of the continent being involved in these wars, we just had everybody hold up their cell phones And when people would say, I have no connection to the DRC, and we were like, yeah, you do, right? And so I think part of what you're saying is like how immediate it is every day, not even just historically. So just to bring up the series here, who and what gets immortalized, right? And we can unpack that word later, but I wondered if you could just start by describing the work that you're offering and describing it in a way that you want to. There have been things written and interviews, but I'm just wondering, often the voice of the artist and why they did or didn't do what we're going to experience.
I think I was thinking about all of the things you all have said and thinking about my own life and the kind of residue of colonialism that's in all of our lives in this very daily, very material way. And so often we like to say, that was bad. We are done with that. And the way evil functions and the way evil lives, it's like it's in this chair. You know what I mean? It's in my pen. It's certainly in our phones. What does it mean to process all of that and to exorcise evil? Like if we want to exorcise that bad man, and he's still here in us, we deal with him every day. We interact with Leopold every day when we wash our hands with soap. There's a whole monologue about that. I hope you come. I really hope mosaics. I'm going to talk about mosaics later directly, but we got to figure out how to get all these brilliant humans to come see this show. It's at night. We'll get you tickets. We're going to work it out. We'll come back to that. But the thing that I was really thinking about is how do we deal with the nature of evil and processing evil and exorcising its presence in our daily lives. That was a big part of how the piece came about. I also, I don't make mosaics. I make performances. And performances disappear, right? There's some, I would argue, inherent resistance to market or to capital, certainly to permanence. And I think these are values of empire and empire building and imperialism, permanence, classification, capital. And I'm excited about how performance as a material inherently resists some of those ideas and becomes a really awesome vehicle to hold these ideas.
Well, there is this idea that this is only going to happen like this in the moment that you come, right? And so that's a really important part of performance. It's never going to be the same, right? It's happening in the context of what happened in the world that day, to the weather, how I feel, whatever I've been through. And so that idea that it's ever changing is also a really important part. And also knowing your work so well, really being able to fold that in and welcoming that kind of ambiguity of what's happening as a very healthy part of telling a narrative and a story, as opposed to like a calcification of the story and the narrative. It is always the same. It's always told in the same way. Doesn't matter who's telling it. We all agree. So let me just ask you to continue a little bit about the performance, because Natacha and I were going back and forth. Like, we're really interested in the costumes and how you developed the environment. We're really interested in, kind of items you use and why, and the radio, the machete. Like, can you talk a little bit about the environment and how that was created and constructed? And then also go into kind of the clothing and other things.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was going to say, as for me, I'm also interested in the clothing because there's something statuesque about what you wear, but at the same time, a bit edgy. Like, why the red? Why the hair that you have? Yeah, the choices behind how you're dressed, which you can see photos in the background, FYI.
When I make performance, I collaborate with so many people. Some of them are in this room. Jonathan has worked with me thinking about dance and is now here kind of thinking about the practice at large. Kiara Ben back here works with me across many different projects. Sometimes as a choreographer, sometimes as an administrative partner, sometimes as a creative collaborator, thinker, mind partner, Lennon and Christopher, who are also working on the piece here. Christopher stepping in on light, Lennon stage management. So the first thing I do when I make a piece is I think about building a team. So that group of people is the first part of making to me. And there are other artists who worked on designing the piece who are not here with us, but who have everything to do with thinking team. And then I think about making a feast. And like any iftar or seder or Christmas dinner, or quite frankly, like birthday dinner, you prepare that feast on behalf of I prepare my feast on behalf of a specific audience, but I want everyone who comes to eat. And so the practice is about almost like making a library, like all the glass. So we have some young artists in this room who are working on mosaics. So I will continue referencing mosaics, and that is why, because we have some mosaic makers. So you have all your glass, right? And that's like the libraries of ideas. Each color is like a library of ideas. So for me, the first thing I do is I start putting together a library of ideas, these lexicons, and then I start chipping and taking little pieces and putting them together to build the picture. And one of the things that I end up doing often, because I have prepared a feast on behalf of specific audiences, is I am prioritizing, let's say, lexicons. And by that, I mean cultural lexicons, aesthetic, artistic lexicons. I mean like literal experiential libraries. I mean historical libraries. I am often centralizing lexicons that are not always centralized in theater practice at large. Okay, but I still want everybody to eat. So I would say that's like a grounding principle to me. You know, one of the first materials that was really important to me in making this piece is one that no one ever talks about. So I am really happy to get to talk about this, which is the plastic chairs, these white plastic chairs that the audience sits in. They're actually really hard to find now because there's much better designs, but there is a white plastic chair that if you have gone to a wedding anywhere in the global south, quite frankly, if you've sat at a bar in Ho Chi Minh City, in Guadalajara, in Cape Town, in Nairobi, chances are you have at some point sat on this very simple white plastic chair. If you've gone to a wedding in any of those places, chances are you've sat on this very simple white plastic chair. And I think of it as this like architecture of how people gather and this way of sitting together, almost like how we're sitting today, that's really different than when you sit in a proscenium theater and how you even relate to the person next to you, and the spacing kind of shifts. And, where my family's from in East Africa and Rwanda, like, being served a cold drink while you're sitting in that chair is just like etched into my like kinetic memory. And so those chairs were actually one of the first materials that I thought about setting up the conditions to conduct an exorcism together, for me to exorcise this residue of Leopold in our lives. So those chairs are actually that's the first material that I wanted to talk about.
Can I have a small anecdote?
I wish you would.
Vis-a-vis those chairs, they're so uncomfortable. And the heavier you are, the more you have to stack multiple chairs to be able to sit comfortably. Yes.
It is not
iconic.
Yes. They're iconic.
They're tiny, and you're crouched. Like none of them have anything to do with the kind of size of a body.
And if it's a grass area, they sink into the soil. I mean, they're a mess.
These aren't too bad. And they're on a theater stage. But it was important to me to have this to have that be a orienting architecture. The costume. I was talking to our design collaborator, who, I would say the other. I'm not answering the questions these brilliant women have asked me. I will get there in terms of the materials they brought up. One of the other things that was really important to me in making this piece was that I didn't want to do like a 2-week research workshop in New York City where I gathered everybody, and then a 3-week rehearsal residency somewhere that everyone could drive to, and then another 2 weeks. And I was like, I can't do that. I can't do that process. I can't, for this piece, after making Jack and that I got to do here with Jane, it's a very big, like, for me, it was a large company of people, lots of time in rehearsal rooms. I needed to change the process. And so a big part of this for me was making it in places that were going to infuse the work with meaning. So we were actually, did a big portion of this work in Guadalajara, in Mexico, in Orozco's former painting studio, which at that point was functioning as a kind of independent art center. And I don't think Orozco did any mosaics that I'm aware of, but obviously Mexican tile making, Mexican mosaics talk about rich tradition. And the artist who collaborated with me on the design for the show and the costumes and the tapestries is actually working on a bunch of mosaics right now. We'll get back to that. Okay. What did we say? We were talking about the dress, the costume. You know, it's like when you look at monarchy, religion, I feel like even nation, there's so much playing with magic and pageantry and meaning making, and so much of it really is costuming and is performance and performative for costuming's sake, for performance's sake, for the sake of kind of aesthetic meaning making and influence. And so, you know, you even think about like red MAGA hats, right? That's powerful costuming. Tri-corner hats and American flag bikinis. Costume counts. Costume matters. There are, of course, traditions of costumes, other traditions of costumes. Thinking about Gungun traditions with all of the kind of accumulation of fabrics. That was a big part of what Christopher was thinking about, what I was thinking about with this outfit. You know, the symbol of the dictator, that jacket, the lapels, the extra gold chains, etc., the bling of it all. Drag balls in New York City, you know, dictator realness with a twist. That was a note Christopher sent. And just kind of colonial uniforms of pomp and circumstance. That was a lot of the thinking in those fabrics.
I think the military gear of some of the kings in Belgium also sort of looks like that.
Swag.
Yeah.
And the belief in magic, of it all, and what does it mean to kind of repossess that magic? And as we do this exorcism of Leopold, how to be like, oh no, we know you truck in magic, so let's truck in some. We're gonna truck in magic. Let's do this. You know, we should probably get a MAGA hat in there somehow. Like that's real. That's magic. That's powerful storytelling magic that people are very clear is magic making. Yeah.
I mean, the thing I would add to the magic is also it's performance, right? I mean, along with costuming comes performance, which includes all of us here. Yeah. We are all performing you're saying the magic, but right, like that. And when you look at this, right, it's so much about what you were saying about like in the Congo, what were people performing when they thought they were going to dress in certain things. There's a couple things that are really influential in the performance and in your making the performance that you haven't mentioned yet. I mean, there's a lot of things, but the text. And that is so central. So maybe you could mention what texts they are and kind of why you chose them.
Yeah, that is, I do think of myself as a text-based performance maker. So the texts that are central to the library building, to collecting all the glass. I'm not going to say, because there's a lot of other text in the performance, but let's just talk about the glass that we started with to make the piece. Mosaic people, are we together on the glass? Lexicons? Okay, great. So Mark Twain wrote a text called King Leopold's Soliloquy. Mark Twain, have you guys read any Mark Twain in school? Okay. And
he wanted to make mosaics, but instead he wrote.
Well, here's the thing about Mark Twain. I forgot this before reading this text. He was a journalist. Mark Twain was a journalist. So he was hired to go to Congo and write about his experience. He refused to go several times, like, I'm not going. Finally, he went. When he came back, his only way to respond to what he had witnessed was to write a fictionalized soliloquy, a monologue of King Leopold kind of defending his exploits. It was like journalism couldn't even hold the truth of what he had bore witness to. So he wrote this exquisite text called King Leopold's Soliloquy. That is one of the anchoring texts in this piece. And then there is Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, which is a text I was not taught in school, even in college. I encountered that text after college, which is like shame on, this is being recorded. Anyhow, so Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism, and then Patrice Lumumba's independence speech in Congo, which is a unbelievably glorious historical artifact. And there's also an opera called The Mute Girl of Portici, which is by Daniel Auber, and it was an opera. It was like the first French grand opera, and when it was performed in Belgium, it is said to have ignited the Belgian Revolution. Act 2, Scene 4, everyone storms out of the opera house and the Belgian Revolution begins. And I was interested in how some of the rhetoric of revolution in that opera, or some of the rhetoric in that opera that gets attributed to the Belgian Revolution, overthrow the yoke that overwhelms us, perish the stranger. Some of how the rhetoric of revolution sits alongside the rhetoric of liberation, the rhetoric of nation, how the rhetoric of nation and nation building and nation reinforcing sits alongside the rhetoric of revolution and revolution making and nation transforming, and the bizarre symmetries between these great proclamations. Patrice Lumumba is a saint. He has been sainted. He is a saint. And I believe he is a saint because of the work he did. And also we're able to preserve him there because he died, he was assassinated with the force of the American CIA before he could fail, before he could come up against the architectures in place and find what could next happen. Now, dear God, I wish we were living in the reality of that failure and the next opportunity that would have built. My point with saying that is not to kill our saints. My point in saying that is that the power of Patrice Lumumba, I do not believe, is that he was a great man. I think the idea of the great man is killing us all and is evil. And how we begin to, between ourselves, like let it start in this room, how we begin to articulate between ourselves what that power is and how we do it outside of the story and the idea of the great man is the only way we will get to live in that future that Lumumba was pointing us towards. So I'm interested in the evil of the great man as an idea, period, regardless if he's the dictator or the revolutionary.
I feel like part of how you do that in the performance itself is by turning to the story of your grandfather, for example, and the details of how people cope with this history and how they're forced to move and the kinds of life they remake and their interaction with wherever they're fleeing and the kinds of lives they're able to recreate in such difficult circumstances. So can you talk a little bit about your grandfather and the auberge, the place that he sort of built, and the place of and how that shows up in the piece, the music, the independence cha-cha, talk a little bit about how one way to move away from the iconicity of big men and is to also pay attention to how people live this story and how they cope with extremely difficult political circumstances. Yeah. Maybe through the music, the radio piece, I guess. Yeah.
You know, when you were talking, what it made me think of was my Patrice Lumumba sold beer.
Indeed.
And if I were a scholar, I think what I would write would be about the revolution of 1,000 sips. and what the social technology of sitting together and drinking a cup of tea for all of you high school students, and for the rest of us having a glass of wine or beer together, the technology of sitting and sipping. The story goes in my family that, so all of this conversation is how far do we pull the aperture back? So even to tell you what I'm about to tell you, I have to go in there and I have to kind of pull the aperture back a little to even tell you about my grandfather selling beer. Otherwise it makes no sense. Or otherwise it's out of context. It is without meaning. So genocide is, it's funny, you know, I say it in the piece. Christopher Myers, the design collaborator, also worked on the text, the monologue. We say, people like to think of genocide like lightning bolts, isolated incidents that come from nowhere. But genocides are more like falling down a flight of stairs. So my family is from Rwanda. But when I grew up, I was visiting the country next door, Burundi. My father was the firstborn in Burundi. So my grandmother was pregnant when they fled with him. And they fled in the 1960s, the genocide that maybe some of you have read about in history books. I still believe in history books. Do you guys have history books? I believe in a future with history books. I put that in the monologue now as well. You might have read about 1994, a genocide at the bottom of the stairs, perhaps, in 1994. But there are so many architectures prior to that, so many tumbling down the stairs prior to that end up in the moment at the bottom of the stairs. So in the 1960s was a moment of genocide, political exile, mini-genocide, moderate, whatever, 1960s, somewhere on the stairs. My family left Rwanda and went to Burundi. Okay, people thought they were gonna go home. People were like, we're just gonna be here for a little while, this is a temporary situation. And my grandfather, the story goes, my grandfather woke up in the morning and headed out into the forest to collect bananas. And all the other families who they come with, the men by the afternoon were sitting in the bars having beers and saying, oh, what are you doing, man? We're going home soon. What are you doing with bananas? Come on, calm down, we'll go home. But he's collecting bananas and he goes to the market and he sells the bananas. And then eventually he sells enough bananas to start making banana wine. And then eventually he sells enough banana wine to buy this little property. And that moment of temporary exile became quite lasting. It wasn't until after 1994, 35 years later, a whole generation of people later, until the family went back to Rwanda. So that first day that he set out to buy those bananas, that he set out into the forest to get these bananas, that becomes the story of how my family amassed enough resource to have this small motel. And this small motel was the first owned by an East African, and it became a place that people regionally would gather, and they would think, and they would listen, and they would sip beer and tea, and think about ideas, and exchange ideas. And at that time, the ideas were fire, and the music was a result of how fire the ideas are. So make some dope mosaics so that we can have some great music, so that we can have some revolutions, because that is how it happens. So they're sitting together and they're listening. They're listening to Lumumba's speech on a record. You know what I mean? They're listening to the independence cha-chas, this moment where the global South is talking to each other, right? So like Vietnam is talking to Ethiopia, is talking to Brazil, is talking to South Africa, is talking to Rwanda. There's this moment where all of these folks around the world are having a kind of exchange around liberation and struggle, and you get music coming off the continent, cha-chas coming off the continent, talking about liberation. And this moment of everybody dreaming into that. So this little piece of land, the auberge, and all the people who went through there, the power of that place, even today, is like utterly magical. It's full of a power that relates to something we can't see. I talk about this, and so pardon me when you get bored when you all come, because I hope you all come to the show, but to finally get towards Natasha's question, the point with that is not that my grandfather was a great man for going into the forest and working hard. It's not this isn't a story of Puritanism. It's a story that when I go to Kigali now, which is, when I tell you it's like a huge city, it's like a huge international city. If I tell the person who's driving a car, if I tell the person who I'm standing at the bank, if we get into it and people want to identify you by your lineage, so like they're gonna try to get you to say who your family is. Like Jonathan probably knows how to get out of that conversation. I try, but I'm not like as adept at getting out of answering the questions. Eventually you end up saying who your family is. And the amount of people who were affected by that little motel in that tiny town just across the border in Burundi is unbelievable. The amount of, oh, let me help you with that. Oh, your grandfather helped my uncle. Oh, that technology, the power of that social technology, the power of the sipping. It's like, what is the monument that we build to that? And how do we get away from the great man and learn to articulate that amongst ourselves so that we can reinforce it and build it and strengthen it and exorcise and kill the great man and destroy that evil that lives in all of us, that lives in me.
That's all you got?
That's all I got. That's all I got.
Well, it brings up a great issue of the role of monuments. Yes. And of course, that's part of like Project Nan's role in this specific way, is that we started a big project called Monuments to Movements, Kill the Hero Worship. And it's really, let's monumentalize the things we actually do together, collective action. And Kaneza is a fellow to Monuments to Movements about evolving democracies, that there is no kind of calcified democracy. It's impossible. But really thinking about the role of monuments, and it really is past, present, future, and the courage to engage in that way simultaneously. And in this work, you really talk about monuments, and you're bringing it up now, but I want you to think about, I mean, part of what we talk about is, kill the hero, right? And kill the hero worship. What does that mean about leadership, right? What does that mean about who we actually look towards as leaders? So it's not just in the past, like, oh, these guys died before they could become real human beings. But like, what does that mean about leadership now? But also thinking about the anti-monument, right? So what is that to you? What is a monument, and then what is the anti-monument? And don't look to her, she's not. No, I'm joking.
I'm so happy to be on stage with these two women, and I want to hear everything out of Natasha's mouth. I have some answers. I have some thoughts on that, but you have some too.
I have a follow-up question, so this might not be helpful, but I'll pose it. I think, there's a relatively recent movement to have art pieces, monuments in Western museums, so in the Americas, in Europe, repatriated back to places in Africa that were stolen during this moment of colonization. And when Jane was asking her question, I was thinking, is that a form of exorcism for you, or how do you think about this whole movement in relationship to reclaiming history, telling a different story, exercising certain aspects of the past or not? There's a lot in there, so begin
so
wherever
much.
you want.
There's this way that it feels like the things that excite me, or the things that I feel like will help more people have healthier lives are so often these echoes that require identifying, seeing the architectures that we are living inside of, and then trying to listen for these echoes underneath. I will concretize this. Yesterday, I was at the Africa Development Conference at Harvard, sitting on a panel, an arts panel, which was brilliantly played. It was like thinking towards 2040, which is like 15 years away. But it was thinking about, largest youth population in the world will be on the continent at that point. And it was the law school hosts this panel at Harvard. And they brilliantly put an arts panel inside of this law school conference. Okay. We were speaking with the people at MOA, which is the Museum of West African Art, which is currently under development. And it's thinking a lot about these, let us call it repatriation initiatives of art objects that have been stolen. One of the conversations we had there was about conservation and conservation practices. And so many of the conservation practices that get taught in museums, that get thought about in museums, require materials that are very hard to get and are very expensive to get to, say, Lagos. Is it in Lagos? It is in Lagos. The museum where MOA is. Oh, it's in Benin. It's in Benin. It's in Benin. It hasn't opened yet. None of us have been, but everyone's talking about it. So one of the things that Dr. Elizabeth, I'm going to say her, anyhow, one of the things that the conservationist who is collaborating on this museum is talking about is not only what does it mean to learn some of the conservation practices that happen inside museums, but the generational practices of conservation that people in Nigeria who have traditionally tended to these objects, that the museum is in the process of learning those conservation practices from leaders in the community, and the delicacy and challenge of learning those practices and bringing them into the museum. What excites me about this is that we have to say what the art is for. We have to say what it is, and we have to recontextualize, we have to name for ourselves, outside of the massive intellectual mind architecture of a museum and what art is in this context. And we have to think about how you tend art through many different, simultaneous, at times perhaps with competing priorities, ideological frameworks of what art is, what its purpose is, what it should do. That, to me, begins to feel, we begin to smell this question of repatriation. And I think because I make something that disappears, what excites me the most are the practices around the art that have existed, and how do we take care of those? And how do we take care of the generations of bronze makers? There was a beautiful bronze maker on the panel with us who works in Benin, who's part of the, many generations of bronze makers in that area. How do we tend to the practices between people that have tended to the objects? I have a lot of faith in the objects to handle themselves. You know what I mean? Like these mummies, like they figured out to be with like the best technology to last forever. Like if you want eternal life, they got like all the equipment and all their surveillance cameras and all the little like tweezers being used to replace it. Like that, well, talk about eternal life. Like I have a lot of faith in the objects to handle themselves. And so the question to me is, how do we handle the practices? I have one more on this though. Well, no, go ahead, Jane.
I mean, hurry
I had
up.
another example. I had another example, but it went out. Go ahead. You go.
I don't want to interrupt. You got it. You got one you really want to.
Oh, it was about these people. It was about the problem of even art making, right? It was about all the people, like, singular everything is a lie. But the story of like singular genius, singular creation, it's a lie on a mosaic. It's a lie on a painting. It's a lie if you write in your room alone. It's a lie. But you know where it is such a lie that it is comedy that we even like play about it anymore is performance. Like we literally make through collectivity and we give unto collectivity. That is what we do, which is not to deny singular force, which is not to deny all the different lanes that each of us hold. It's not hierarchical, but there are different roles. Like, yeah, I'm the benevolent dictator of this show. But it doesn't happen and it doesn't get made without the force of all of these folks coming together. And so the things that I would say in my practice that most relate to this question have to do with tinkering on the problems of how we talk about making work and how work gets made tended to, and what it means to show my own accountability to the artists that I'm in practice with, and how do I show. So if I can't, I'm not going to change capitalism by myself. You know what I mean? Like I lived on communes, I lived in squats. Like I'm not tripping. Like even when we grew all our own food, we bought our peanut butter. You know what I mean? I'm not confused. Like we had a telephone. Like that is not. I'm not on that trip. But I am curious about how so if this is my practice, which is inherently a collective practice, how do I show up to Kiara's practice? How do I show up to Jonathan's practice? Which again, I don't believe in Kiara's practice. I don't believe in Jonathan's practice. I don't believe in my practice. But if we're going to be in that, how do I show up to that? Is part of a thing that I work a lot on. And how do I make sure that Jonathan's not just one-offing here, but I get him hooked up on this May Day thing that I just got thrown into at Times Square. Make sure he gets paid right for that. You know what I mean? Like that is part of how I think about practicing and thinking about this question that you've been asking with Project And about collectivity is the word I'm going to put on it.
That's how you kill the great men, because they don't operate alone. They have a whole army behind.
Right? I gotta say one thing on this. This is being recorded. Natacha might be like, okay. There's so much to say about Rwanda and contemporary politics, and I don't know who's in the room and if we have some like great debates to have. But I'm gonna say one thing that's been bothering me lately, is that everybody wants to ask about, and I am just acknowledging, I'm not touching DRC and Rwanda unless somebody wants us to go there, in which case, dear God, we will go there. But I'm just saying it, and I'm putting it here, that someone can take it off the shelf if they want. What I'm going to talk about is everybody wants to talk about post-Kagame Rwanda. But what is post-Kagame Rwanda? And I've started to feel like Rwanda has cast a magic spell on the world and given them a narrative of the great man. But what's happening? 72% women in governance? All of the systems of infrastructure building that have been happening that think about collective law, that think about collective decision making, I've started to think that it's that application of the idea of, oh, but what happens after Kagame, which is not to say he's a very powerful, incredible leader, but it's a little bit not dealing with the collective work that has happened in this country against every odd in the world over the last 25, 30 years. That's what I have to say. And I said it on camera. No comment.
No, I can comment. Jen got it. No, I can comment. I told you I wanted to. I have lots of things to say. Okay, the first thing I'll say, who's talking about post-Kagame? That's the first time I'm hearing it.
I feel like that's like, oh, but what happens to Rwanda after Kagame? What happens to Rwanda after Kagame?
Okay, so this is what I'll say. So obviously I'm writing a book on narrations of 1994 and on how we understand post-colonial violence. And every time I send anything for review, the peer review, so you send an article and then you get reviewed by people blindly. They don't know who you are and you don't know who they are. There is always a good paragraph asking me to talk about Kagame. It's so hilarious that now I have this fantasy that when I have time in the future and I have energy, I want to write an opinion piece called "Where is Kagame?" Because I get asked that question so much. But okay, so let me give you, I think, what I would say in relationship to this conversation. I think there is a trope in history, in anthropology, in political science, in international relations, generally in journalism. There is a trope about, there is a lot of emphasis and a lot of obsession about big men, especially vis-a-vis Africa. So I think part of the obsession with Kagame, I think I read it like that because it's a familiar image. When you think Africa, you think big bad dictator, you think big men at the helm, and so it's much easier to talk about it in that form. So that's the first comment. The other comment is, in a way, what you're saying, which is the part of what's happening in, the overall structure of what is happening in Rwanda, in a way, has echoes with what happened in 1994, what happened before, and you can't get at the complexity by focusing on one person, however powerful that person is. So yeah, I think the obsession with him has to do with how people read Africa as this land of, submissive women ruled by big bad men.
And also, I also feel like his sainthood too, because so much of the it's just it's fascinating. Yes, Paul Kagame is the president of Rwanda and has taken the country through extraordinary transformation that I would argue there is nothing comparable to the leadership and the tending to the many in some ways that has happened over the last 30 years.
And also the fact that across the world he's seen that way. So it's not like a local analysis. So I just want to say one thing, and this is not a multiple choice question, but who do you think came up with the idea of a powerful male narrative and a non-collective narrative? Like, there's not a mystery of where this came from. And like when you're talking about, I don't do anything that's not collective, it's like nobody does, right? But the male leadership narrative is the one that's taken over. And who's promoted that, right? And who's, kept that in the history books and in the current, newspapers. I do want to bring back one thing about what you're talking about, repatriation and libraries and conservation and archives. And, we have to remember these are sites of power and privilege and influence. So even if we unpack those words, right, who decides this is archivable or keepable or that this should be something that we go back and study or that is kept in a way that it's of value, right? And we have to think about that in terms of like the rolling heads of all these statues. I was asked to be on a lot of commissions, a couple outside the country and then a lot in the country, that were like, what should we do about saving these statues? And we've taken them down, but like now what does Robert E. Lee mean to us? And I was like, the same thing he meant to us 2 days ago, because we had him up 2 days ago. And now that we've decapitated him and put him into a museum, we actually have to think about who we are, right? And who we were, right? And so when you're talking about archives and libraries and conservation, like who's deciding what deserves to be conserved? Right, and valued. So I want to jump to one thing that really does have a lot to do with the idea of leadership, which is about something that the three of us were talking about, like failed civilizations. And I'm just going to put towards a quote from Cesar, which is, a civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a sick civilization. A civilization that plays fast and loose with its principles is a dying civilization. And then there's just a couple bullet points just to hammer this down, which is, a civilization that proves incapable of solving its problems creates a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems are a stricken civilization. And a civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. So I would love for the two of you to talk about, like when you talk about that tumbling staircase, right? And that staircase of violence and crumbling of a civilization? Is it only when we reach the bottom to genocide? Do we have to wait until the trickery and deceit, really smashes us? Or, and I would offer, in times that we are living in, not just in this country, but across the world, right? All of these things are present. So at what point do we know that civilizations are failing? And at what point are we able to interject and be part of shifting that narrative or that story? Or is that not possible? Don't look at me like that.
No, I'm thinking. Do you want to start?
I mean, I want everybody in the audience to answer it. I think we're in the process of making answers together. And this question of how to see what we see and know what we know and unsilence ourselves is a practice that we are all building together right now. The thing that I find so striking in hearing Jane say that language right now is fast and loose. Can you imagine? Césaire wrote a civilization that plays fast and loose with its principles. Whew. Yeah, I think it's about seeing what we see. It's like, it's how do we care about a starvation that's going to take place over a lifetime, over a generation? Like, how do we pull the aperture and see what we see and know what we know? Like on that staircase, how do we see the slipping carpet and the floorboards creaking? How do we see what we see and know what we know before the crash at the bottom? We all love the crash at the bottom. Humans love the crash at the bottom. But what does it mean to train ourselves to see what we see and know what we know and unsilence ourselves? And I think that's a practice we all get to build. And I do think sipping tea together and spending time together in rooms. Did anybody read Bowling Alone? Robert Putnam? I feel like I would be so curious what you all, the mosaicists, would think about his theory. You guys should read that book, and you should make a mosaic about it. Even if you don't like the book. I'm going to crudely talk about that theory. Basically, he's like, look, democracy is built on people bumping up against each other and spending a little bit of time with each other. And he's like, this was kind of pre-cell phones when he wrote it. Like pre-cell phones in the way they function in our lives now. So it's like even more extreme now. But he was saying the kind of isolationism that's happening, if everybody would just join a effing bowling club, we could save democracy, is his point. It's like if we could spend a little bit of time together, just in like chill ways, somebody who bought the different egg brand than you bought, somebody who parks their car at the other parking lot than you park your car at, and this sort of thing that would happen at a bowling club, that is what, that is critical to a functioning democracy. I think there's a reason that theaters were placed next to where people vote. Like, I think it's not about the machete, it's about the stories that wield the machete, and we have to work on those stories, you know? Yeah.
I mean, it's a layered question, so I will be brief. But I think for me, part of, I see killing the narrative of big men alongside killing the, big meta narratives about history. History is made up of all kinds of small practices and people doing things together and making all kinds of things to get to the big ideas of freedom and capitalism, etc. So, yeah, civilization, for me, the language of civilization still is, not to discount, I think, Césaire, because he was writing in a moment when that was the kind of like dominant language that he was trying to critique and reverse. But civilization for me is still hierarchical. It's in the realm of like the meta history, the spectacular history of heroes and big men, the linear story of like beginning, middle, and end. I think life doesn't work like that. I think social political formations don't work like that. It's we move back and forth. It's not linear. There are lots of different things happening at the same time, and it's not always a neat, coherent story with an origin, a middle, and an end. It's a constellation of practices. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I think. I think away from civilization and the narratives of big men into collective practices.
Yeah, I agree. We are going to open to questions. If you have no questions, there's like 1,000 more, but I'd rather hear from you guys. And here we go, right here.
Not really a question. I mean, I have so many questions, but it's just a comment. I really liked your observation about Lumumba, that he was assassinated before he had the chance to fail. And so often there's this narrative of the revolutionary who becomes the dictator. We can think of Viktor Orban, Daniel Ortega, Robert Mugabe, and in a certain sense, even Obama, when he came up against the calcified architecture of how this country is run, he made some progress, but not enough. So I thought that was a really great observation.
Are there other questions? Thank you for that.
No one is allowed to leave this room until one of the mosaicists asks a question. You don't have to ask the question yet, but I will personally block those doors.
Going back to when you were talking about the costumes and the choices you're making around the hair and things like that. So as a performer, those look heavy and hot. So I'm just wondering, like, what that does to you, not just, as an actor, but as the character.
Yeah, the hair is really heavy. My neck usually hurts by the last week. It's fun. It's fun. Like, there's also this flyness. Like, dictators be bringing the style. They know about magic. So those braids are just fly. You know? They're fly. That's what they're there for. I also, I love braiding as a creative practice, as a rich performance practice, as a rich aesthetic practice, as an unbelievably powerful cultural practice that has survived oceans and many different kinds of genocides. So investing in braids of some kind, and also thinking about the Atlantic, let's say. Yeah, it's pretty heavy. I think one of the things that the designer on this project, and Christopher Myers, and I have thought a lot through the various projects we've collaborated on is kind of histories of masking and how different cultures have different relationships to masking. And in the West, often a mask is made to hide. And in so many, I would say, in most cultures, masks are made to show, to invite, to make visible. And so I think building this costume, and even how we deal with sound and the voice and the kind of effects on the microphone, so much of it was like a masking process, was how to build the mask in order to get to the truth, how to build the mask in order to be more true versus to like hide and put a different truth on top. And so I think the costume is really a lot about building a mask. And therefore, as a performer, I enjoy it because I feel more at ease.
Any other questions?
A couple of things that I was thinking in listening to you all is one is that Jane has often said that art is not the first responder when we're in a catastrophic situation, but it's the second responder. And I've always thought that was really important, useful to think about how important art is. On the other hand, right now, I think it might be the first responder, given what we're dealing with and the kinds of truth that needs to be told that art can tell. One of the things I wondered, Kanisha, whether you are embodying a monster, in essence. Do you feel any sympathy for him?
I don't see myself as separate. Like, I really do mean the residue in everyday life. Like, I live with him. I wield his tools. I interact with his tools. So to me, it really is, how do we understand the monsters within us and without us in order to find these other things? So I think of it as much as a gift to myself and at its best for all of us to begin exorcising our daily contact with that monster and how integral to everyday life he is. I went to a bullfight once in Madrid, and I'm a vegetarian. I literally had tofu with me. And, or I was a vegetarian then. I eat fish now. And there was this American family who was sitting in front of me, and they were just horrified at the violence they had witnessed. And they scurried off. And I was thinking about, when the violence is like, the tradition in bullfights is that when the bull is killed, all of the meat goes to orphanages. That's part of how that tradition works. And so it's interesting to me, like, how we process the violence that we consume and engage with daily, And I always thought about that bullfight as one of those moments of like, oh, I wonder if they're going to go have a steak, And like, what does that mean, the discomfort in that, witnessing that ritual, and then the really atrocious violence of not that any of this is hierarchical, but the atrocious violence of how a cow was lived and then was slaughtered, like the atrociousness of the life and then the slaughter of eating the steak or the burger. And then how do we contend with ourselves in the violences that we consume constantly?
Yeah, if I can add, I think this is why we started with that historical, like the prelude to the Congo today, and I listed all the various countries in Africa that were involved in the wars, but I could have listed also so many Canadian, American, French, British corporations. I mean, the entire world is in the Congo, is extracting, and to sort of, it was for us to have a sense of the centrality of this place, but also how everyone is involved, and we don't hear that. So we're all implicated in some ways, I think, is the question. So despite the horrendous things that Leopold did with his association, Civilizing Central Africa, there are echoes today and lots of continuities.
And all the materials of it all. Americans were the first to actually sign on to Congo Free State. Everyone was like, that's a little crazy. There's one dude who's going to be involved, who's going to own a corporation that's extracting. That's a little crazy. And America was like, oh yeah, let's go in. And in fact, I don't say this to call out this entity in particular. I actually say it for the opposite reason. But Guggenheim was one of the first investors in Congo Free State. I actually got a Guggenheim Award to work on this project, speaking of exorcism, and Guggenheim Fellowship. But everything, but it's not about that. You know what I mean? It's about like the story of this pen and the story of this chair and of course, the tantalum in my phone that is exciting to me and interesting rather than they are bad and we are done with them of it all.
I think, Sunny, that it is a fascinating question that we all navigate every day. right? And so it's on a spectrum, right? So it's not just like, genocide lives next to the bullfight, right? Or a ceremonial killing or, but I think there is a spectrum of violence and a spectrum of violence that we all negotiate. And some of it's on our own terms, and some of it is on the terms of the societies in which we live or choose to live, or choose to reject, right? And so I think the idea of taking on this person and this violence, and it's a very specific one, and I think also one that is identified across a lot of narratives and boundaries. And so there is this idea of like, how do we navigate those things? And are there certain things that are variables, or are they all constants? Do we decide that this thing was bad and it'll always be bad, or, in those kind of gradations? So it's also a question that Natacha brought up about this idea of negotiating the violence and how we take it in. And I think it also really relates to what Sunny's saying.
And it's a very thoughtful question about performance. I have some friends who are musicians who are very worried about me for doing this. So I also appreciate the the thoughtfulness of what you're saying about performance and what does it mean to like touch that.
Well, because there are a lot of actors, Hollywood actors who will not play certain roles, right? They don't want to play the white bigot who kills the black family who's just going down to the debate. They don't want the world to see them as that person or that character. So there are things in performance and embodying it that does have a big effect. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to stress what you said. I mean, the word spectrum is important. We are all implicated because by virtue of living in this world, but we are differently implicated and we have different access to power, and there is certainly a spectrum. I mean, you can't possibly be implicated in the same way as Leopold was. I think I wanted to stress that point.
No, I don't know if absolutely. And I think it's more that we see what we see and know what we know and process inside of the structures that we live more than we are implicated in the violences. To an extent, I think I would say is more the proposition in thinking about exorcism as a practice.
I think implicated and also benefiting, right? So those are different things too. I mean, it's part of a big conversation here about the history of slavery in the United States. And people will say, oh, my family had nothing to do with that. But then if you live here at all, you benefit from it. Your family came here except for certain populations because there was a possibility of something better, right? And so this idea of benefiting as opposed to being implicated, right? And those roles can overlap and they can be very different.
Yeah, but also there is no outside. To go back to the story you told, you can live in a commune, but you're gonna buy the peanut butter or have the phone to communicate to someone. So it's all those things, I think, implicated, benefiting, but also, is there a real alternative or a real outside? I don't think so. As it not yet.
The mosaicists are going to build it. Mosaicists, I want to hear a question from you. It can be any kind of question. It could be about artistic practice. It could be whatever. It could be about your own work. You could have an aesthetic question about a problem you're having with the glass. Anything.
How long did it take you to develop this performance, and how did you get past the roadblocks?
Whew. Yes. So I developed it really differently than other pieces, as I had said. It was this evolving of, because how do you deal with your life and the needs and resources of your own life. So that was part of what I was going through. And something that's true in much of my work, and there's a beautiful sound designer who collaborates with us, Lucille Mills in the back, who designed the production Jack And that we had last year and is stepping into a design that was built by two other artists and kind of growing with it. We'll see what happens. We don't know. We're going to make something. I knew that I wanted the spine to be sound. In opera, I also direct opera. You talk about through composition, that something is through composed. So the way that I started with this piece was creating a library of sounds with these two sound designers, Camila Ortiz and Ian Andrew Askew, and talking through the sections of the piece I knew I wanted to have, and then having the composition grow as the primary spine. So first we worked on the sound design, and so I probably made it over like a year and a half. But the time in the studio was greatly reduced because I knew I wanted to create it in a way that wasn't going to be about sitting in dark studios in the middle of winter in New York and feeling sad, and was going to be about being in places that were going to fuel the work. So, yeah, I would say it was about a year and a half, but the time in the studio was probably more like a month total in the various places that we built it. And the thing that helps me when I get, you said roadblocks, right? That's such a good word. I'm gonna talk about it like artist to artist, like in terms of my internal roadblocks, but I'm happy to talk about it structurally around roadblocks too, but I'm gonna talk artist to artist to you about it. So for me, the thing that happens is I get really scared, I get afraid. And it's always about how do I find something that is more interesting to me than how scared I am? And that I have to keep following that thing. So like it was more interesting to me to try to make this work in this other kind of way than I was terrified to not do the tinkering hours and hours and hours that Lucille spent with me making the Jack And score and like having 10 people in the room while we were working on 3 seconds of sound for 5 hours. I was terrified not to make in that way because that's a way that, first of all, I know that I love, and I know that I kick ass in. And so to make in a different way, but I was so excited about the idea. I was so excited to go to Orozco's studio. There was like this big, like, the bourgeoisie eating a feast, you know what I mean? Like paint mural of his on the wall. And I knew that mural was in the room we were gonna work. And I was like, yes, we're gonna speak Césaire's words under that mural and something of that is gonna get into the work. And I was so excited by that. So I feel like the question to me is always, what are you more excited by, more turned on by, more interested in than how terrifying it is to bet on yourself to make art?
Yeah, that's the internal fire, right? And it's really that whatever you're doing becomes more important than the fear you have. And to remember that no one is fearless, right? I mean, that is such an important part. I think also what you're talking about, how long in the time, I mean, if you look at these two humans, they are incredibly thoughtful. So I would say kind of pre-birth, they were working on the work that they're doing. And so that kind of temporal quality of creation is always really hard. You know, it's like when someone's is like, how much did that paint cost? You know, how much did you pay for that paint? And you're like, that has nothing to do with this thing I created. So I think even that idea of time, like you sitting here, is part of you doing your creative work, right? And what you get up to do afterwards, which I think is go have tea, since, you know, she's pretty much mentioned that 4 times. I mean, all the rest of us,
times when you come to the show.
All the rest of us are going to make murals, but you're going to have tea. If there aren't any more questions, are there any? Oh, there you go.
So I am Nigerian and I have a lot of roots back home, and I know you were talking about your family and your grandfather, and I was wondering how you felt when you went back, basically. So I know personally I struggle with some guilt because I feel like here we have a lot of opportunities that I feel like I need to share with others that I feel back home and stuff like that. So I'm wondering how either you if you do have the guilt, how do you deal with it? And if you don't, what are some things that you do that you give back or just to share with others and have a social network?
You came to play. I don't know what I give. I don't know what I give. I have 4 things I want to say, though. I have 2 stories of just acknowledging how much I get. And you know what? Honestly, that's, to be real, the development aid that I provide to the United States is resourced by Rwanda and resourced by the intellectual, spiritual, and kind of cultural data that I can use to rehabilitate broken practices here. So that's the truth. That's the true answer. And I can concretize that in stories, but I know that I know that you have your own stories of what has happened back home that you bring here to help people's lives here go better. I want to talk about that so much. And I will say 2 things that are, I'll say 2 things. There's an amazing arts festival called the Ubuntu Festival in Rwanda. And it's a performing arts festival. And it has brilliantly been able to centralize lots of South-South exchange. So like a Cambodian circus troupe will come and perform at the Genocide Memorial Amphitheater in Rwanda. So I believe so deeply in what that festival has done. And so I try to, in ways, support that festival. And I would say the strongest support I've offered is that I believe in touring networks, and I believe in cultural exchange, and I believe in bowling together and sipping tea together and all the different us's of the world having exchange. So by bringing my work to Cairo and then to Kigali, I was able to forge a little bit of a communication between some of the artists in Cairo and some of the artists in Kigali. So I think that would be something that I would think of as strong. I have also started working on an arts center in Kigali that we will be calling the Gahinga Contemporary Art Institute. Hey, which is very exciting, and trying to think about how do we do this in a way that grounds in the knowledge and practices that help rehabilitate the rest of the world and still have global conversations that can take care of artworks that are going to have to travel into contexts like this where they need to be tended a certain way, and also so how to have global multidisciplinary arts conversations, but that grounds in the practices and ways of relating and being and thinking about finance and thinking about human beings that are so desperately needed in the rest of the world. I also want to talk to you for hours because of some nuances of some of the very bizarre relationships to my particular family and how class and power function. And I just am excited for you and for everything you're thinking about, and trust yourself and trust your work, and trust the information that you are bringing to help others here also. What do you have? But Natacha, what do you have to say to that? What's your name? Why'd you roll your eyes and take a deep breath? Yeah. What's your full name? Folodara. Nice.
On the name, have you seen that viral TikTok/Instagram video going around with these, people? Someone asks you, "What is your American name?" And someone says, "I don't know, Mary." And then, "What is your African name?" And then 5 minutes of listing your whole name. So you just reminded me of that when you said, "What is?" I have 10 names. It's true. You know, I mean, this is related, not answering the question, but related to this. It happens in my classroom too all the time. Like, you know, someone comes and we're introducing ourselves and, oh, my name is Mary. And I look and I'm like, but I see another name, and the name turns out to be, I don't know, Natacha Nsabimana, but call me Mary. I'm like, what is the relationship between Mary and Nsabimana? But yeah, I understand the context. How do I answer this question? I mean, listen, for me, I try with the little means that I have to do what you were talking about earlier, to collaborate. So I also like wholeheartedly believe that there is no such thing as a singular act of genius, whether that's writing, painting, etc. So people always produce things in collaboration with others. So I try to replicate that. I'm working on a film. I collaborate with Kaneza, with a bunch of other people. And I think, yeah, through collaboration is how I would answer that. That move between different places, because I'm lucky enough to be able to do that. But even if I wasn't, I think also working with where you are, I think that's also a way to be in community, I think. I think you can be in community anywhere, is how I would answer it.
Jonathan, do you have something to say to that? No? Okay. Just asking.
I think Jonathan is remembering that you said he was going to get paid well to work on this.
For May?
I just wanted to bring that up before we close. But I just want to add, which is what you're saying about giving back, is that I just would add there's no unnatural partners. So anything you're doing to generate the velocity and energy and knowledge is part of that. And then also there's no end user. I think what you're all talking about is not like giving in one particular way and then it lands there, but how those things really work as an ecology, an ecology of ideas and influence and generosity.
There's also that real talk of like, put on your own mask before helping others, and that is hard. I'm just getting there, and like you have to put on your own mask, or you cannot help others. And so like, take care of yourself, and like that's the real talk. And it is uncomfortable to set boundaries with your elders. It is hard work, but that airplane adage is the stone truth, especially if how clearly you feel that prayer and that work as part of you. Get your own mask on.
One more.
And then one more question and then we'll wrap up. Let me come over.
Have you or would you do this, perform this in the Congo or Rwanda?
If Faustin would invite me, there's a wonderful choreographer in Congo, and I would be so honored if he invited me. I've thought about doing it, honestly, getting to talk with Laura Page about this work here, and getting to think with Natacha and Jane. I think I'm saying the thing more clearly. I was a little scared to say it before. It's a big deal to say what you just said, and what we're talking about Lumumba, about what does it mean to process our saints. So I think now it's a little more ready, and I'm a little more ready. I was supposed to do it in Rwanda a couple of years, like 2 years ago, and I just couldn't handle it. I was like, this is too much. I can't, like, my family's going to be there. Oh my God, I say my grandfather's name, Lord have mercy. I definitely will have to clear it with my family before I do it. I think there's one auntie who, if she said, I would let her edit it, and then if she gave me permission, I would do it. But I hope to do it at the Ubuntu Festival. I don't know, this summer, not this summer, maybe next summer. Yeah. Those boys have this dossier and this video in their computers. They know. All those programmers know. Antwerp knows. What is it? What's the big one in Brussels? That's Paris, Festival de Temps. What's the Kunsten Festival des Arts. They know, it's there.
Well, with that, thank you all so much for coming and speaking. And thank you all for being here. Please Please be sure to come to the show next weekend, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 7:30. It's going to be amazing, obviously. Not Sunday. Sorry, I'm not nervous. Cool. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys.